Chapter 14 Curse Unleashed. The sky turned the color of bruised bone just before the summons came. A storm without thunder. A wind that howled without air. Evelyn had read enough mythology to recognize the signs. Something unnatural was coalescing, and it had Magnus Thorne's fingerprints all over it. She was summoned not to the throne hall or council chamber, but to the Circle of Binding, an ancient ceremonial pit carved into the center of Ironfang Keep. It was a place of blood oaths and sacrifices, of magic older than language. And the moment she stepped into it, barefoot and stripped of everything but a threadbare linen tunic, she understood exactly how high the stakes had climbed. Lucien wasn't allowed to follow. No allies. No blades. Just Evelyn. And the king. And magic that reeked of salt, silver, and something disturbingly like grief. Magnus waited at the center of the circle, surrounded by chalk-drawn glyphs that shimmered faintly even in daylight. His robes were black, not the ceremonial kind, but the kind that said this was not a celebration. It was a sentence. She didn't bow. She didn't ask why. She simply stared at him, standing tall despite the cold stone biting into the soles of her feet. He studied her like one might study a cracked artifact, fragile, but possibly still dangerous. "I've done everything I could to avoid this," he said. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "Really? Because your track record with avoiding cruelty is, not impressive." Magnus exhaled slowly. "You don't understand what you are. I know enough to know I'm not yours." Something flickered in his expression. Not rage. Not pride. Pity. Which, for some reason, made her angrier than anything else. "You think this is about obedience," he said. "About loyalty. But it's about balance. Daisy made you to be a failsafe. A tether. You weren't meant to lead wolves. You were meant to anchor them. And by anchor, you mean contain, direct, restrain the chaos that is Lucien." Her heart thudded. "Lucien isn't chaos," she snapped. "His healing. His learning. His choosing a different path. And you," Magnus said, stepping closer, "are the reason he's forgetting who he is." Evelyn's voice was a blade. "Good." He didn't argue. Instead, he raised a hand and the air snapped. The circle flared to life, glyphs sparking, heat rising in waves like a furnace had opened beneath the earth. Evelyn staggered as the world tilted. Her knees hit stone. Something thick and invisible pressed against her skin, like walking into a wall made of memory. The glyphs weren't just symbols. They were keys. And she was the lock. The magic unfolded her like a book. Not physically, not violently, but intimately. Thought by thought, layer by layer. It touched her childhood. Her dreams. Her fear of being alone in crowds. Her secret thrill at solving problems no one else could. Her guilt. Her stubbornness. Her memory of kissing Lucien in the woods while frost melted beneath them. It saw her. And then it searched for what came before her. And that's when things broke. The pain wasn't sharp. It was deep. Like someone was pulling thread from her soul, tugging it backward through time and lives and legacy. She saw herself, not as Evelyn, but as someone older. Someone cloaked in moonlight, walking through fire, holding a dying wolf in her arms and whispering a promise. "I will return. I will finish this." The face wasn't entirely hers. But the eyes were. And they were burning. Evelyn screamed, but not from agony. From recognition. The curse Magnus unleashed wasn't to kill her. It was to reveal her. He didn't want to destroy Daisy's heir. He wanted to bind her. Claim her power before she realized how to wield it. But he'd made a fatal mistake. Because in his arrogance, he'd cracked the door too wide and the flood came rushing through. The circle shattered. Not figuratively. The stone split. Glyphs burned black. Air snapped inward like lungs drawing breath for the first time. Evelyn rose, not lifted, not helped. She rose. Hair lashing, eyes glowing faintly violet, her blood alight with ancestral fury and the dangerous clarity of someone who had nothing left to fear. Magnus staggered back. She looked at him, head tilted like a scientist dissecting a flawed hypothesis. "You shouldn't have tried to awaken me," she said. Her voice echoed, but not from her throat. From beneath. From Daisy. Guards rushed the circle. Lucien broke through them like a falling star. He reached her as she collapsed, power draining too quickly, consciousness slipping, hands trembling like tuning forks still humming with old music. He caught her. Whispered her name like it was a tether. And she smiled, even as everything went dark again. Because now she knew. She wasn't just part of the rebellion. She was the turning point. When Evelyn woke, her veins didn't feel like blood vessels anymore. They felt like wires. Conductive. Alive. Still tingling with the aftershock of something ancient and unstoppable having passed through her like a current. She didn't open her eyes right away. Not because she was afraid, though she was, in that quiet, analytical way she reserved for ambiguous test results, but because she needed time to process the sensory data. The bedding was fur-lined but crisp. Hospital corners. The room smelled like juniper, char, and Lucien. There were fingers in her hair. Warm. Familiar. Absent-mindedly stroking the strands like prayer beads. "You're awake," Lucien murmured. He didn't sound relieved. He sounded reverent. She cracked an eye open. "No offense, but if I died and this is the afterlife, your decorating skills leave something to be desired." His laugh was hoarse. "You almost died. Again. You're making a habit of it. I like to keep things dramatic. Builds character. You also burned a 50-foot glyph into the stone floor. With your mind." She blinked up at him. And then, because sarcasm was her native language, "Okay, but did anyone get that on video?" Lucien didn't kiss her. Not right away. He sat beside her like she was both fragile and radioactive, which, honestly, was kind of fair. She'd gone full supernatural nuclear meltdown, and the fallout had clearly spooked everyone except Lucien himself, who, despite being raised by a monarch with emotional intimacy issues and a taste for ceremonial violence, somehow still knew how to hold her like she mattered. "You've changed," he said, brushing his thumb across her cheek. Evelyn nodded. "I feel like my soul's been reprogrammed. I was thinking more, brighter." She blinked. "Brighter?" He gave a sheepish smile. "When I found you after the ritual, you were glowing. I was also unconscious." "Yes, but ethereally unconscious." She groaned. "Please don't make that a meme." Too late. Senric's already painting it. She tried to sit up. The room tilted. Lucien caught her immediately. "Easy. You were unconscious for 2 days." Her brain short-circuited. 2 days? You mean I've missed 2 days of passive-aggressively restructuring the patriarchy? His mouth twitched. "Don't worry. Isolde has been delivering handwritten pamphlets about equitable alpha selection while you napped. We may have accidentally started a literacy movement. Be still, my revolutionary heart." He sobered slightly. "There's more. Anthea's been at your bedside since you collapsed. She says you've awakened the second memory. Whatever that means." Evelyn swallowed. The images came back in fragments: silver fire, moonlit skin, the whisper of a voice not her own promising to finish what Daisy had started. "I think I remember being her," Evelyn said. "Daisy. Or a version of her." Lucien leaned closer. "And it wasn't like watching a movie. It was like dreaming someone else's nightmares." She was terrified. But she was also furious. Why? Because she knew they'd try to control the next one. "Me." He was silent for a moment. Then, she was right. Evelyn pushed herself upright despite the head rush. "Lucien, I can't afford to be just your mate anymore. Or a symbol. Or a scholar trying to reverse engineer social hierarchy with middle school science fair projects. You've never been just anything." She reached for his hand and squeezed it, fiercely. "I need to learn what I am. Not just magically, but systemically. If I'm the key to their mythology, I need to know the mechanics. The physics of how Daisy's curse works. I need schematics, not stories." Lucien exhaled. "Do you want my help?" She looked up at him. And something in her softened, even through the electric buzz of her new reality. "I want your partnership, Lucien. But I need autonomy. I need you to believe I can lead without burning." He leaned down then and kissed her, slow, reverent, anchoring. "I don't think you're going to burn," he whispered against her lips. I think you're going to ignite. That night, while the kingdom muttered about omens and the seers consulted smoke trails for prophecy, Evelyn made her first request as the awakened soul of Daisy. She asked for a library. Not just access to one. A new one. Open to wolves of every caste and rank. Human and non-human. She wanted texts on magic, medicine, politics, and basic mechanical engineering. She wanted a printing press restored. She wanted pens distributed like weapons. Magnus hadn't shown his face since the ceremony. But his silence was not defeat. It was retreat. Which, Evelyn knew, only meant he was watching. Waiting. She was no longer just a girl who'd wandered into a kingdom of wolves and survived. She was the variable he hadn't accounted for. And if he thought awakening Daisy would make her controllable, he'd just opened a door no one could close. Chapter 15 Lucien's Sacrifice. Love, Evelyn decided, was basically a scientific paradox. It defied entropy. It refused to be contained. It expanded, transformed, and when tested, shattered whatever system it tried to inhabit. There was no equation for it, no fixed unit of measurement. You could run all the regression models you wanted, but at the end of the day, love would still explode like unstable matter in the wrong hands. And Lucien was holding it in bare fists. She could see the cracks forming. He thought she didn't notice, but Evelyn had a PhD-level ability to detect avoidance behaviors. The way he flinched when someone mentioned the Western Ridge. The way his hand lingered over his ribs a fraction too long after sparring. The half-second delay before answering questions about his patrol routes, as if he were editing for emotional content. It wasn't until she found the vial of silver root beneath his bed that she confronted him. "You're dosing," she said quietly, holding the glass between two fingers. Voluntarily. Lucien didn't deny it. He just sat on the edge of the windowsill, bathed in the light of a moon he now rarely looked at, and said, "Magnus put a price on your head. I decided to raise the cost." She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She walked over, slow and deliberate, like one of them might startle and bolt. And then she took his face in both hands and said, "You idiotically beautiful medieval disaster. Do you think your suffering makes you more useful to me?" Lucien's smile was almost boyish. "It makes me less traceable. Silver mutes my scent. Dulls the pull. To me." He flinched. Evelyn's throat tightened. "You were trying to hide from me. I was trying to protect you. If I'm not predictable, Magnus can't use me to get to you. You are predictable, Lucien. You'd die for me. Wouldn't you?" "No," she snapped. "I'd live for you. There's a difference." They argued. God, they argued. Because that was what two people who loved each other in the middle of a political insurgency did. They threw words like knives and prayed the wounds would heal clean. Lucien accused her of being reckless. Evelyn accused him of martyrdom. He said she didn't understand the price of leadership. She said he didn't understand the price of survival. Somewhere between "you're not invincible" and "you're not replaceable," her voice broke. And Lucien did something she didn't expect. He knelt. Not out of submission. Not theatrics. But out of grief. For what they were becoming. The next day, Lucien disappeared. No note. No farewell. Just his pendant on her pillow, a stone from the Snowvale River, smooth and black and threaded on a strip of leather she'd braided herself. Evelyn didn't panic. She ran regression models in her head instead. Behavioral likelihoods. Risk ratios. She mapped out the kingdom's perimeters and eliminated possibilities with surgical precision. He hadn't been kidnapped. He hadn't been killed. He had left. For her. Senric found her 2 hours later in the war room, holding a map of the western border like it might bleed if she pressed hard enough. "Don't say it," she said. He leaned against the doorframe. "I wasn't going to." "Liar." "I was going to say he's making a tactical play." "Which one?" Senric's smile faded. "The kind that involves probable maiming and absolutely no backup." She swallowed. "He thinks he's expendable. He thinks he's a shield." "I don't need a shield. I need a partner." Senric's voice softened. "Then go get him back." Evelyn left the keep that night. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't even warn the council. She took only what she needed, her boots, a blade, and the memory of Lucien's last words echoing behind her ribs like sonar. If they come for you, I want them to find me first. The forest greeted her with silence. The kind that hung heavy, like snow waiting to fall. She moved quickly, heart pounding with purpose and fury. Not just at Lucien for his self-sacrificial gall and frustratingly poetic intentions, but at the world that had taught him love was a form of punishment. That protection meant erasure. That devotion required disappearance. She found him at the edge of the Nightfang border, shirtless, blooded, and standing in front of a pack of rogue loyalists with a knife in one hand and silver running through his veins like ink. His eyes, those endless, storm-dark eyes, landed on her like a confession. "You're not supposed to be here." She walked straight into the ring of blades and said, "Neither are you." One of the wolves lunged. Lucien caught him mid-air, slammed him into the dirt, and turned to the rest with a snarl so primal it cracked the air. Then, before another drop of blood could fall, Evelyn stepped between them, palm raised, eyes glowing. And the earth answered. The standoff lasted exactly 7 seconds. That's how long it took for the rogue wolves to realize Evelyn wasn't bluffing, that the calm in her eyes wasn't fearlessness, it was certainty. Not the foolish kind that got people killed, but the kind that came from knowing, without a shred of doubt, that power didn't have to shout to be terrifying. Her hand remained raised, palm open like a scientist inviting an experiment to begin. The air shifted, not with flame or lightning, but with something more subtle. More structural. Like the laws of nature were quietly being renegotiated around her. Lucien was the first to move. He stepped behind her, not out of deference, but alignment. He didn't need to lead this moment. He just needed to anchor it. Evelyn's voice, when she finally spoke, was soft. But it carried. "You think loyalty is proven with blood," she said, scanning the wolves with cool, measured focus. "But I've watched people destroy themselves trying to protect what they love. It's not strength. It's trauma dressed in valor." No one replied. So she stepped closer. "Lucien is not your sacrifice. He's not your king. And he's not your scapegoat. He's mine." There was a collective stillness at that word. Mine. Not a claim of ownership, but of responsibility, of partnership, of choice. Later, after the rogues had fled and the adrenaline had begun its slow retreat, Lucien sat with his back to a tree, blood crusted along his side, jaw tight with pain he refused to acknowledge. Evelyn knelt beside him, cleaning the gash on his ribs with practiced hands and a wet scrap of her undershirt. "You're lucky," she muttered. "An inch lower and you'd have punctured a lung." Lucien tilted his head. "Are you lecturing me or flirting with me? I can multitask." He chuckled, wincing when the movement tugged the wound. She slowed, her fingers suddenly still. "Why didn't you tell me? About the plan? About the silver? About any of it?" Lucien looked down. "Because I needed you to keep believing in the future," he said. "And I didn't know if I'd be part of it." Evelyn swallowed around the lump in her throat. "You idiot. I prefer strategically delusional." She pressed her forehead against his. "Don't do it again. Don't erase yourself to protect me. I wasn't protecting you. I was protecting the idea of you. The version the wolves believe in. The one who can actually fix things." She pulled back to meet his eyes. "Lucien," she said slowly, carefully, "that version of me doesn't exist without you. Not because I need you to save me, but because you remind me why I fight." He blinked. And for the first time in days, maybe weeks, he let himself look at her not as the hope of a kingdom or the legacy of a myth, but as a woman. Just a woman. Bruised and brilliant and stubborn as hell. "I'm in love with you," he said, like it was both a confession and a surrender. She nodded. "I know. Is it selfish if I want you anyway?" "No," she said. "It's only selfish if you try to keep me safe by cutting me out of my own story." He exhaled. And finally, he let her see the exhaustion in his shoulders, the fear that had been riding shotgun beside his love since the day they met. "I thought I was built to protect," he whispered. "That it was all I was good for." Evelyn smiled softly, brushing her thumb over the scar on his cheek. You were built to feel. And that's why I trust you. They camped there for the night, just the two of them and the distant crackle of embers from a fire neither of them really needed, but both wanted for comfort. Evelyn lay beside him, staring up at the stars like they were a chalkboard only she could read. Lucian curled an arm around her waist, grounding them both. You know, she murmured, the scientific definition of sacrifice isn't always negative. Lucian glanced down. No. In thermodynamics, a system can only reach equilibrium if something gives energy to something else. Sacrifice can be about balance, not just loss. So, you're saying my emotionally reckless stunt has a scientific precedent? I'm saying that loving someone deeply enough to risk everything doesn't make you foolish, she said. It makes you human. Or, well, wolf adjacent. He huffed a quiet laugh. And then they lay there, entangled and silent, as the wind carried the scent of pine and ash and the unspoken promise of everything still ahead. By morning, Evelyn knew what had to be done. Magnus had made his move. Now it was her turn. Not with war. Not with blood. But with a reclamation. Of Lucian's name. Of her magic. Of their future. Chapter 16 Soulbound. The ritual wasn't supposed to happen this way. There were supposed to be seasons of waiting, omens read in smoke, ancestral approvals carved into ivory tablets. A court full of noble wolves murmuring from balconies. A ceremonial bath in moon-blessed water. Probably some chanting. Instead, there was a half-ruined shrine in the woods, a battered prince with a healing gash under his ribs, and a woman with wild hair and muddy boots standing in a ring of stone, hands on her hips, declaring, "We're doing this. Right now." Lucian blinked up at her, still half-crouched after re-sparking the fire. I'm sorry, are you proposing? Not proposing. Demanding equal magical footing via mystical soul anchoring. Completely different. He gave her a look. She gave it right back. Evelyn wasn't joking, though, sure, the sarcasm helped buffer the full emotional gravity currently trying to compact her ribcage. The truth was simple. If she wanted a future where she wasn't just a symbol or savior or myth, she needed to take control of the story. And if she and Lucian were going to survive what was coming next, Magnus, prophecy, an increasingly unstable rebellion, they needed more than love. They needed certainty. And nothing in wolf-kind said certainty like a soul bond. Lucian stood slowly, brushing dirt from his hands. The firelight threw shadows across his face, catching in the curve of his jaw and the darker edge of his eyes. You're sure? No, she said. But I'm brave. And statistically speaking, the benefits of soul binding currently outweigh the risk of dying alone in a political coup. He stepped into the stone circle, barefoot and serious now. Do you even know the terms of the bond? Mostly. Mutual psychic access. Increased pain transference. Emotional bleed over in moments of distress or, heightened physical proximity. Lucian arched a brow. Heightened physical proximity? She cleared her throat. You know. The. He leaned in. You mean sex, Evelyn? Oh my God, why are you like this? He smiled. But then, as they stood facing each other in the ritual circle, the smile faded into something softer. He reached out, brushed a windblown strand of hair behind her ear, and said, "Whatever happens next, you're still you. This bond doesn't own you." Her breath hitched. "No," she whispered. "But I choose it. I choose you." The ritual itself wasn't flashy. There were no lightning strikes, no celestial bodies rearranging themselves to form ancient sigils in the sky. Just blood. A few drops from her palm, a few from his, mingled on a flat stone between them. Then breath shared in the hush between words. And finally, intention, whispered in the language that existed before language. I see you. I know you. I bind myself not to your destiny, but to your choice. The warmth started in her chest. A slow spiral of heat, not painful, but not tame either. Like an algorithm solving itself in real time, each heartbeat syncing to his like matching data points. Lucian's eyes glowed faintly, gold melting into silver and back again. Evelyn didn't need to touch him to feel the shift. She was him. And he was her. Not in the way of codependency, or even primal instinct. but in the way entangled particles respond to each other across impossible distances. She felt his pain echo against her ribs like thunder. She felt her own fear answered with steady strength. She felt everything. And yet, somehow, she remained whole. Afterward, they sat on the temple steps, their fingers laced, silence wrapped around them like a third presence. "Are you okay?" he asked, voice rough with awe. She turned to him, her mouth curving into something that was not quite a smile but not quite not one, either. "You're inside my head," she said. "That's a very cluttered place to be. I hope you brought metaphorical coffee." He laughed softly, then sobered. "It's more than I expected." "Same." Lucian hesitated, then said, "I thought it would feel like losing myself. And instead, it feels like finding home." She leaned against him. "Then maybe this bond isn't about ownership. Maybe it's about orientation. Like magnetic north. Like gravitational center." Lucian kissed the crown of her head. "You're such a nerd. And you're lucky I find that endearing." The soul bond changed everything. Not dramatically, not immediately, but in subtle, precise ways. Evelyn's instincts sharpened. Her empathy grew more specific, more attuned to emotional nuance. Lucian's healing accelerated. His nightmares diminished. They moved like mirrored equations, each solving for the other without trying to. The rebellion noticed. The monarchy panicked. Because two wolves soulbound were rare. But a soul bond between a werewolf prince and the reincarnation of the witch who birthed the first hybrids? That was prophecy. That was war. That was something no crown could contain. The first reaction came from Anthea. Which tracked, honestly. Seers always had a flair for being early, even when time wasn't linear for them. She appeared the morning after the ritual without announcement, gliding through the keep's warded gates like mist through a sieve, her green eyes bright with something Evelyn didn't yet have a name for. Not quite joy. Not quite concern. Something more, telescopic. "You've done it," she said, her voice low and infuriatingly calm. "You tethered your lifelines." Evelyn raised a brow. "Would you like to offer congratulations or start burning sage? I'm unclear on your vibe." Anthea didn't answer right away. She circled Evelyn once, like a wolf examining the wind. Then she stopped behind her and pressed two fingers to the space just between Evelyn's shoulder blades. Evelyn flinched. Heat radiated outward from the spot, like someone had flipped a circuit breaker in her spine. "She's awake," Anthea murmured. "Not just you." "Ha! Daisy." Lucian stepped forward instinctively, placing himself between them. "Is that a problem?" Anthea's lips twitched. "Only for Magnus." By midday, the court knew. And by knew, Evelyn meant the entire inner citadel had somehow reached a collective state of organized panic. Every corridor buzzed with speculation, hushed voices behind carved doors, wide-eyed stares from silver-masked counselors, and enough sideways glances to cause a neck injury epidemic. She hadn't even had coffee yet. Lucian, for his part, seemed wholly unbothered. He walked at her side with the casual possessiveness of someone who had fought assassins before breakfast. His fingers brushed hers whenever the crowd thickened, as if to remind her not just that he was near, but that he was hers. Not just soulbound, but chosen. Constant. "You'd think we declared war," Evelyn muttered as they passed a group of palace scribes who immediately stopped breathing. Lucian smirked. In wolf culture, publicly merging life forces is considered very assertive foreplay. "I hate everything about that sentence. I can whisper it again later." "Absolutely not." He grinned. When they entered the Hall of Accord, the silence was instant and total. The council was already assembled, Anthea at the far end, Senric at her right, and Isolde sitting with her legs crossed on the high table like it was a picnic blanket. A few minor lords blinked at Evelyn like she might spontaneously combust. At the center, as expected, sat Magnus. He did not stand. He did not bow. He did not even blink. He simply stared at Evelyn like she was a statistical anomaly that wouldn't resolve. "Care to explain yourself?" he said finally, his voice quiet, flint-edged. Evelyn clasped her hands behind her back. "You mean the part where I participated in a consensual soul bond with your brother, or the part where I didn't ask your permission?" A beat of tension. Senric coughed into his hand. Isolde made finger gun motions at her and mouthed, "Slay." Magnus's gaze sharpened. "Do you understand what you've done? Enhanced my cardiac synchronization rate with Lucian's, created a neural feedback loop for mutual stress mitigation, and ensured that any attempt on one of our lives now risks destabilizing both." Silence. Anthea, smiling faintly, said, "What she means is, the bond has geopolitical consequences." Magnus stood. Very slowly. Evelyn's skin prickled with the quiet menace in his movements, like a predator testing the air. "You have no lineage. No standing. You are a foreigner, an anomaly pulled from the woods like a wild herb. And now you wield ancient power like it's a game of dice." Lucian stepped forward. "That anomaly just stabilized our people's most volatile magical inheritance with no casualties, no bloodletting, and no subjugation. So maybe rethink the condescension." Evelyn smiled sweetly. "Besides, science is a game of dice. Just ask Schrodinger's cat." Isolde gasped. "Oh my God, I love her." They left the council chamber technically intact. Though by Evelyn's estimation, at least half of the noble houses were already drawing contingency diagrams for what her bond with Lucian meant, politically, magically, reproductively. Because of course someone had already leaked that part. As they walked the long corridor back to their rooms, Lucian touched her elbow. "Are you okay?" She gave a tired half-smile. "Define okay. Am I breathing?" "Yes. Do I want to throw every old noble into a volcano and build a progressive school on the ashes?" "Also yes." He chuckled. "You were brilliant. You were mine." That made him stop walking. He turned to her, hands cupping her face like he was framing something fragile and priceless. "You mean that?" Evelyn rolled her eyes, which were suddenly misty. "Lucian, we just swapped magical mitochondria. I think that qualifies as exclusive." He kissed her then, slow and soft, not like claiming, but like remembering. Like confirmation. Like belonging. That night, she dreamed of the stars. Only, they weren't distant or cold. They were moving threads of light weaving through her bones, singing in frequencies she couldn't quite name but felt down to the molecular level. And in the center of it all stood Lucian, glowing faintly gold, his heartbeat echoing through her like gravity. When she woke, she didn't need to check if he was there. He always would be. Chapter 17 Fall of the Crown. It started, ironically, with a garden. Not a battlefield, not a throne room, not even a midnight execution. A garden. A patch of tangled herbs and wild blossoms tucked behind the east wing of the keep, technically royal property, though no one had tended it since the last wolf queen died during childbirth 3 decades prior. The law said she'd planted lavender and foxglove while pregnant, and when the council refused her plea to outlaw silver collars for human slaves, she'd poisoned herself using both. The lavender still bloomed. Evelyn found it one morning after a sleepless night, the scent strangely grounding, earthy and a little sweet, like a reminder that not all things here were cruel. Lucian found her kneeling in the dirt, mud streaked across her cheekbone, an ancient trowel in hand. "Please tell me this is a metaphor and not a nervous breakdown," he said gently. She looked up. "Why can't it be both?" He crouched beside her, brushing a leaf from her hair. "You don't have to do this alone." "I'm not," she murmured. "That's the problem. I'm starting to think I'm responsible for everyone." Lucian paused, then said, "Responsibility isn't the same as guilt." Evelyn stared at the roots in her palm. "But they keep planting things in poisoned soil," she said. "And expecting them to grow anyway." The metaphor became an action plan by noon. Evelyn didn't hold court. She didn't issue a decree. She started weeding. And people, wolves, humans, even half-bloods who usually kept to the shadows, started helping. First it was the stable boy. Then the kitchen steward. Then a captain from the Northern Patrol. By the end of the week, the garden was no longer symbolic. It was a hub. For whispered plans and shared bread and the quiet, revolutionary idea that life could be something other than survival. That loyalty didn't have to be paid in blood. And somewhere between the thyme and the bleeding heart vines, Evelyn realized something vital. Power didn't always fall. Sometimes, it simply bled out. Magnus noticed. Of course he did. Kings always notice when devotion stops being reflexive. When people stop flinching. He called a closed council session 2 days later. It was supposed to be procedural. Instead, it was a trap. Lucien knew the moment they crossed the threshold. The scent of iron was too strong, the guards too still, like pawns arranged in a game already half played. Evelyn's hand found his, grounding them both. They were ready. What Magnus wasn't ready for, what he could never account for, was the absolute calm in Evelyn's gaze. Not rage. Not fear. Just inevitability. Lady Hartwood, he said, lounging in his obsidian chair like a monarch in a Renaissance painting, all shadow and symmetry. Or should I say, witch Daisy reborn. Evelyn didn't flinch. You can say whatever makes you feel taller. Clever, he said, smiling coldly. You've grown bold since binding yourself to my brother. Lucien stepped forward. Bold, or free? Corrupted, more like. Evelyn tilted her head. You say that like it's an insult. But really, freedom is just unlearning obedience. Magnus's hand twitched. Ah. There it was. Crack number 1. Do you know what keeps a monarchy alive? Magnus asked. Myths. Not magic. Not bloodlines. Not brute force. Myths. He stood now, tall and terrible, his voice like thunder beneath stone. You threaten the myth, he said. That wolves are dominant. That humans are weak. That the blood of the first was born to rule. Evelyn met his stare. Then maybe, she said softly, the myth needs rewriting. Cynric was the second crack. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't draw a weapon. He just stood and said, perhaps it's time the court heard from someone other than the crown. And Thea, seated at his left, raised a brow. And perhaps the people are already listening elsewhere. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was charged. Magnus understood then. He didn't rule anymore by fear. He ruled by habit. And habits could be broken. That night, Evelyn stood on the garden's edge, barefoot and bone-tired, and watched a dozen small fires flicker in the hills beyond the keep signal lights from allied villages, each one a heartbeat of resistance. Lucien came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. You started a revolution by planting marigolds, he murmured. She leaned into him. Sometimes the smallest thing destabilizes the biggest system. Entropy, he said, smiling against her hair. You'd love thermodynamic metaphors. They're efficient. He kissed her temple. You're dangerous. And you're proud. Terrifyingly so. She closed her eyes. The crown hadn't fallen yet. But it was listing. And soon. It would shatter. The end came not with a sword, but with a sentence. It was spoken during what was meant to be a routine tribute ceremony, an annual performance of control where trembling humans were marched before the court like livestock and chosen by nobles like luxury imports. Evelyn, of course, had already planned not to attend. She had made a quiet vow the day she watched a child cry behind a wooden cage, her wrists raw from silver thread, her eyes dull in a way no child should ever be. Evelyn couldn't undo centuries of cruelty overnight, but she could, at the very least, not watch it happen like it was a parade. Lucien had agreed. His exact phrasing had been something like, if I have to sit through one more of Magnus's thinly veiled power pageants, I will personally stage a coup with kitchen utensils. So when the procession began, and Evelyn didn't show, it wasn't considered an act of defiance. Not until others followed. First it was Anthea, claiming the stars required her elsewhere. Then Cynric, who had urgent negotiations with a southern envoy, an envoy who, suspiciously, hadn't arrived yet. Even Isolde, who usually brought popcorn to political drama, called in existentially tired. The rows of benches in the throne hall looked emptier than they had in years. Magnus sat on the high seat, jaw clenched so tightly his temple ticked. Then Evelyn walked in. Alone. Wearing nothing ceremonial, no crown, no cloak, no polished stones. Just her boots, her spine, and a blouse dusted with pollen from the garden. She looked unimportant. Unarmed. She was neither. She walked straight to the tribute dais and stood there in silence. Magnus stared down at her, voice sharp enough to pierce bone. You weren't summoned. I wasn't needed, she said. I came to witness. To witness what, exactly? She turned to the humans lined up behind her, some chained, some drugged, all of them silent in the way people become after too many years of being scenery. To witness them. Her voice didn't rise, but it carried. Someone inhaled sharply. Evelyn faced the crowd. This tradition, this tribute, she said, the word like ash in her mouth, was created to remind everyone that humans are beneath you. That their worth lies in obedience or bloodline, and nothing in between. No one interrupted. Not even Magnus. And yet, she went on, voice steady, you all watched me walk into this court, this kingdom, alone, powerless, uninformed. You watched me rise. Not because I was chosen. Not because I bowed. But because I refused. She turned then, locking eyes with Magnus. And you still think you rule. The room didn't gasp. It breathed. Collectively. Sharply. Like lungs awakening after years submerged in smoke. Lucien joined her without fanfare. He didn't speak. He didn't posture. He just stepped beside her and reached for the key dangling from the ceremonial guard's belt. The man, more boy, really, didn't resist. Just handed it over like he'd been waiting for the moment all his life. Lucien began unlocking chains. One by one. No one stopped him. The council didn't move. The guards didn't twitch. It wasn't fear. It was choice. Magnus stood slowly, like a monument trying to remember it was mortal. You mistake tolerance for weakness, he said, voice like thunder barely held in check. You think because you've stirred the herd, you've won. But you forget one thing. He took a step forward. I am the bloodline. I am the crown. Evelyn didn't step back. She lifted her chin. No, she said. You're a fossil. And this is evolution. Later, no one would remember exactly who dropped the banner. It wasn't ripped or defaced. It simply slipped from the northern arch and crumpled into the dust, a velvet flag embroidered with Magnus's sigil, the ancient wolf's head. It wasn't burned. It was left behind. And somehow, that was worse. Because fire is angry. But abandonment is deliberate. Magnus didn't die that day. He didn't scream. He didn't attack. He didn't collapse in a theatrical display of fallen tyranny. He just left. Walked through the hall like a man in a dream, his footsteps echoing too loud in the space that had once made his voice thunder. A few guards followed. Most did not. Lucien didn't chase him. He looked at Evelyn, his gaze full of something achingly tender and entirely certain. He won't give up. No, she agreed. But we don't have to kill the past to outgrow it. That evening, Evelyn stood on the garden wall as the moon rose. There was no coronation. No speech. She didn't want to rule. She wanted to heal. Lucien joined her, barefoot and golden in the firelight, the soul bond humming like a heartbeat between them. What now? He asked. She leaned against his shoulder. Now we begin again. Chapter 18 Rebirth in the Modern World. The first thing Evelyn noticed was the fluorescent light. Not the warm, flickering glow of candle sconces or the dappled blue of moonlight through moss-covered stone. No. This was sharp, buzzing, corporate lighting, the kind that made skin look vaguely green and time feel like it was stalling in place. The second thing she noticed was the beeping. Sterile. Rhythmic. Clinical. And then came the third, what scientists might call a moment of dissonant cognitive reentry and what Evelyn called a hard reset. Because somewhere in the back of her skull, where magic and logic had once warred for dominance, her brain did the math. 4 bag. White tile. Catheter. A television playing muted news. She was in a hospital. Not a war tent. Not a witch's den. Not even the palace infirmary. A regular, everyday hospital, complete with faded posters about flu shots and a vending machine hoarding Kit Kats behind fingerprint-smudged glass. It was jarring. It was overwhelming. It was home. She didn't scream. Mostly because her throat was dry and she couldn't find her vocal cords for a solid 15 seconds. Instead, Evelyn blinked up at the beige ceiling tiles, counted the irregular patterns in them, 3 vaguely looked like continents, and asked herself if this was death. Or purgatory. or a coma-induced hallucination powered by her subconscious need to escape. But then she heard the voice. Soft. Familiar. Not magical, but grounded, like gravity. Like soil after rain. About time you woke up. Evelyn turned her head slowly, and there he was. Lucien. Not in fur. Not as a wolf. Not even in tattered ceremonial garb. But in jeans. A flannel shirt rolled up to his elbows. A pair of very modern black boots. And holding, of all things, a paper cup of Starbucks. She stared. He raised the cup in salute. I had to fight a barista named Ethan for this. He did not want to spell Lucien right. How? She croaked. He moved to her bedside, offering a sip of water first. Long version involves cosmic contracts and a seer with a taste for string theory. Short version, you came back. So I followed. Evelyn blinked at him. You followed me across worlds? Lucien smiled softly. Of course. You're the only one who knows how I take my coffee. Her throat worked as she tried to sit up. But this world, it's not yours. You don't belong here. His expression turned thoughtful. Maybe. Or maybe belonging is less about geography and more about resonance. Like tuning forks. If you strike two that are calibrated to the same frequency, even across a room, the second one vibrates. She stared at him. That's annoyingly poetic. He shrugged. You like it? She did. Even if it made her teary. Recovery wasn't a montage. It wasn't neat. It didn't come with a soundtrack or a spiritual montage of epiphanies. It was real. Messy. Disorienting. Evelyn had to relearn her own name in paperwork, had to sit through psych evaluations, and field visits from nurses who didn't understand why a girl reported missing in the mountains for a year had no signs of frostbite or trauma. Lucien handled most of it. He got her out of the hospital. Found her a quiet rental house on the edge of the city. Learned to use a microwave. Grew irrationally fond of documentaries about fungi. He was still him. Still possessed a low growl when someone got too close to Evelyn at the grocery store. Still had a habit of tilting his head like a curious beast when confused by modern slang. Still curled around her like a living shield when they slept. But he was gentler now. Not because he was less wild. But because the world was. And he didn't need to protect her from it. Just within it. Sometimes Evelyn wondered if she'd imagined it all. The palace. The blood-stained rituals. The soul bond. But then Lucien would brush her fingers at dinner, and her pulse would skip in perfect harmony with his. Or he'd know she was anxious before she said anything. Or she'd wake from dreams of moons and fire and find him already watching her with that soft, unshakable devotion that made her feel more real than air. And she knew. They were both living proof that love wasn't limited by dimension, or prophecy, or even time. One night, curled on the couch beneath a weighted blanket and watching a rom-com that Lucien didn't fully understand but liked anyway, they're enemies but also co-workers? It's a whole genre. Evelyn turned to him. Do you miss it? She asked. Lucien looked at her. The world. The wolf kingdom. The magic. The court politics. The rituals. He considered it. Then said, I miss who we were. But I love who we are. She smiled. Then, and if Magnus shows up on my doorstep tomorrow? I'll kill him with your electric kettle. Perfect. Lucien learned to use a toaster with the same reverence he once gave sacred blades. To Evelyn, it was deeply unfair that someone who used to rip throats with his teeth could now make perfect golden waffles while humming along to Florence and the Machine. But there he was barefoot in her tiny kitchen, sleeves pushed up to reveal the still faint sole mark that curled along his left forearm like an ivy brand, waiting patiently for the exact crunchy outside, fluffy inside moment to strike. I think I've mastered the modern breakfast right, he said proudly, presenting her with a plate like it was a war trophy. Evelyn blinked, coffee mug in hand. You're terrifyingly competent. This is almost suspicious. He smirked. It's the mating bond. Enhances intuition. Even for carbohydrates. She choked on her coffee. Their days found a rhythm, not a routine exactly, because Lucien had all the domestic predictability of a particularly affectionate hurricane, but a rhythm nonetheless. Evelyn went back to her research job, working part-time at a lab where she catalogued rare plant DNA and quietly inserted werewolf regeneration patterns into mitochondrial studies. Not that she'd admit it in grant proposals. Lucien spent his time exploring first the house, then the neighborhood, then the local library where he became absurdly obsessed with natural history documentaries and spent one memorable afternoon arguing with a 6-year-old about whether wolves had monarchies. Lucien won. Barely. He also shadowed her grocery trips like it was a royal procession. "Do we need this much yogurt?" he asked one afternoon, holding up a tub with scientific suspicion. "Yes. I'm stress-eating calcium. I could hunt something for you." "No hunting in Whole Foods." He pouted. She kissed his nose. But it wasn't all seamless. There were nights Evelyn woke gasping, memories of chains, of Magnus's voice like poison, of the cold sharp feeling of not being enough. Lucien never asked what she'd dreamed. He simply pulled her against his chest, one hand firm between her shoulder blades, the other tangled in her hair, murmuring things that didn't need translation. "You're safe. I'm here. We're home." Sometimes he hummed not a song, not really, but something low and primal and steady, like the purring of a god who'd finally found peace. And eventually, Evelyn would sleep again. Once, she tried to explain it to her therapist. Not the whole truth, obviously. Just the pieces that might be diagnosable. "I feel like I've lived 3 lives," she said, fingers clenched around a travel mug. "One in a world that chewed me up. One in a world that worshipped me. And now this one where I'm just Evelyn." Her therapist had nodded thoughtfully. "And which one do you think is the real you?" Evelyn had smiled. "All of them. The hardest part was trust. Not in Lucien. That had never been the issue. But in herself. Because it was one thing to survive a kingdom that wanted to brand you, break you, and bend you into prophecy. It was another to walk into a coffee shop and order a latte without bracing for danger. Lucien noticed. Of course he did. And instead of pushing, he did something better. He built space. When she needed silence, he filled the room with music. When she needed light, he found fairy lights shaped like moons and taped them around her bed frame. When she needed air, he led her on long walks through the park, pretending to get lost even though he could track her heartbeat blindfolded. She didn't need to tell him what she felt. She just had to show up. And he always met her there. One weekend, they drove out to a cliffside trail overlooking the sea. Evelyn packed sandwiches. Lucien packed a hunting knife and 3 water bottles. Just in case. In case of what? She teased. Ambush by aggressive pelicans? He gave her a very serious look. You joke, but I saw one steal a child's lunch once. It was horrifying. They sat at the edge of the world, wind in their hair, silence between them, not empty, but full. Like breathing after a long dive. Like returning from war and finding the world still spinning. Like love, not the storybook kind, but the kind that made space for grief and laughter in the same heartbeat. Lucien laced his fingers through hers. I don't need a kingdom, he said quietly. Not if I have you. Evelyn turned to him, heart thudding in that old, familiar way like the moment before a leap. Good, she whispered. Because I'm not a crown. I'm a choice. His smile was slow, wolfish, whole. And I'll keep choosing you. In every world. Chapter 19 A New Beginning. Evelyn never thought happiness would smell like wet dog and rosemary. But that was the scent of Sunday morning, Lucien trailing muddy footprints across the hallway after his urban foraging adventure, carrying what appeared to be a bundle of sticks and insisting it was a sacred herb used in prehistoric shifter rituals. It's rosemary, she said flatly, raising one eyebrow as she sipped her coffee from a mug that read I woke up like this, sarcasm. Lucien, indignant and slightly disheveled, held up the bundle like a prize. It's wild rosemary. Which makes it cooler. And slightly more magical. It's from Mrs. Keating's garden. He scowled. She offered. Said it might help me settle down. You growl at squirrels, Lucien. That ship has sailed. He grinned, plopped down beside her on the couch, and proceeded to shake water droplets onto her arm like an enthusiastic Labrador. You knew what you were signing up for. Did I? She laughed, leaning into his warmth anyway. The truth was, No, she hadn't. Not really. What she'd signed up for was survival. Resistance. The impossible ache of being claimed and cherished and changed. What she hadn't expected was this, the slow, relentless intimacy of cohabitation. Folding laundry together while debating the ethics of interspecies diplomacy. Arguing about dishwasher organization like it was a UN resolution. Falling asleep to the hum of city life and the steady rhythm of a man who used to be a prince, now murmuring in his sleep about her hair in a tone that suggested her conditioner was worthy of poetry. They planted tomatoes. This wasn't metaphorical. Lucien insisted on a small raised garden bed in their postage stamp backyard, even though Evelyn kept reminding him that their soil was basically compacted clay and old soda tabs. It's symbolic, he'd said, pressing seeds into the dirt like it was a sacred rite. Rebirth. Fertility. Tomatoes. You just want to stab something with a trowel. He winked. Why not both? To be fair, they sprouted. Eventually. Though Evelyn suspected the plants only survived out of fear. Lucien sang to them. In Old Wolf. Which, as it turned out, involved a lot of low humming and the occasional howl. The neighbors never complained. Though one of them did drop off a noise ordinance pamphlet with a passive-aggressive smile. Lucien read it, shrugged, and taped it to the fridge like a trophy. They talked about the future in pieces. Not in sweeping declarations, but in the language of everyday decisions. We should get a dog, Lucien said one night, curled around her under a blanket that smelled faintly of cinnamon and damp leaves. A real one. Not a cursed prince. Evelyn blinked. You want to own a dog? He frowned. Is that weird? A little. Like Zeus adopting a lightning bolt. Lucien considered. Maybe a cat, then. They're arrogant. I relate. They compromised on a rescue mutt named Bean. Bean had 3 legs, 1 ear, and the emotional stability of a raccoon on espresso. Lucien adored him. Evelyn secretly did too. Even when Bean chewed through her copy of The Origin of Species and vomited on Lucien's boots. Especially then. They went to therapy. Together. It was Lucien's idea. Which was either wildly evolved or completely on brand for someone who'd once bitten a duke for speaking ill of Evelyn's freckles. Their therapist, Dr. Hayes, was a soft-spoken woman with an impressive collection of cardigans and an uncanny ability to ask questions that felt like minor exorcisms. So, Lucien, she said during one session, what does safety look like to you now? He'd paused. Then said, it looks like a couch. And quiet. And knowing Evelyn's heartbeat is still beside mine. Evelyn had pretended not to cry. Lucien didn't pretend. He just reached for her hand like it was instinct, like centuries of war and prophecy had burned away everything but this simple, fragile need to be known. Some days were hard. Lucien still flinched at the smell of silver polish. Evelyn still woke from dreams of wolves howling beneath red moons. But those days didn't define them. They were notes in a longer melody. And slowly, so slowly, they stopped being sharp. Just soft echoes. Reminders of what had been endured. Survived. Outlived. Evelyn once read a study that said emotional trauma altered the brain's grey matter, literally reshaping its architecture. She liked to think hers had remodeled itself into something better. Not tougher, exactly. Just more elastic. More capable of holding contradictions. Like pain and joy. Fear and trust. Lucien in a flannel robe trying to make pancakes with magical sea salt because the alchemy matters. She still teased him. He still teased back. But beneath it all was this invisible thread, a soul bond, sure, if you wanted to be poetic. Or maybe just the undeniable chemistry of 2 people who had burned together and decided to build instead of bury. One morning, Evelyn found Lucien staring at the sunrise like it had wronged him personally. She padded up beside him, yawning. Deep thoughts. He nodded solemnly. The tomatoes died. Evelyn blinked. That's tragic. They gave their lives bravely. She bit her lip. You do realize we can just buy more seeds. He turned, wrapped his arms around her waist, and murmured into her neck, I love that you say we. She melted just a little. Because this was what no prophecy had ever promised. A life stitched from small things. Ordinary. Domestic. Glorious. There were many things Evelyn thought she'd never experience again: warm showers without the scent of blood, laughter that wasn't edged with exhaustion, mornings where her first thought wasn't "who must I protect today?" She especially didn't expect to find peace in assembling IKEA furniture. Yet there she was, sitting cross-legged on the living room rug in her pajama pants, wielding an Allen wrench like it was a sacred talisman, while Lucien held up the half-finished bookshelf like it was the corpse of a fallen enemy. "This design is fundamentally flawed," he said, scowling down at the instruction manual. "Why are there no words?" "Because the designers assume you can interpret hieroglyphics under duress," Evelyn replied, fitting a dowel rod into place. "Also, you skipped step 4. Step 4 was insulting. You're just mad it told you to rotate gently." He gave her a look. "I don't do anything gently." "That's objectively false," she said, then immediately flushed. "I mean, except when you're holding my never mind." Lucien smirked and returned to tightening the side panel, his biceps flexing beneath the soft cotton of his shirt in a way that made her seriously question the laws of physics. They got the bookshelf up. Eventually. It tilted slightly to the left, but it stood. Much like them. Wobbly. Imperfect. But enduring. Some nights, they lay side by side and counted the lives they'd lived. "I was a barista in a past life," Evelyn claimed once, deadpan, her fingers tracing idle patterns over Lucien's chest. "My latte art was atrocious, but I made up for it by passive-aggressively correcting customers' grammar." Lucien laughed low in his throat. "I was probably an apex predator. Or a forest god with trust issues. Very on brand. I had a crown made of bones. You still have it. It's metaphorical now." She propped herself on one elbow, studying him. "Do you miss being royalty?" He shook his head. "Power without purpose is just noise. His voice dropped. "You, here, now, that's purpose." It stunned her every time, the way he could say things that felt like ancient poetry wrapped in modern clarity. It also made her want to cry. But, like, the happy kind. The ugly sob in an airport reunion kind. So instead of replying, she kissed him. Soft. Long, thorough. Lucien made friends. Accidentally. There was the barista who started setting aside a croissant for him every Thursday. The old man at the dog park who insisted Lucien looked like his grandson, God rest his soul. The teenage girl at the bookstore who talked to him about Norse mythology without realizing she was describing parts of Lucien's actual childhood. He didn't mean to be charming. But there was something about him, something ancient and still and utterly disarming. Like standing in front of a glacier and realizing it wouldn't hurt you unless you deserved it. Evelyn watched it all with a sort of scientific fascination. This was behavioral adaptation in real time. The apex predator learning to be human. Or, more accurately, choosing to be human for someone he loved. That someone being her. No pressure. They threw a housewarming party. Mostly because Isolde showed up unannounced and declared their living space embarrassingly human and in dire need of ritual cleansing via wine and Beyoncé. So they lit candles, uncorked questionable Pinot Noir, and invited the few people who knew just enough to keep Evelyn from self-combusting with secrets. Lucien baked something. No one could identify it, but everyone went back for seconds. Evelyn wore jeans and a lip stain she hadn't touched since before the forest. There was music. Laughter. The smell of garlic and citrus. Someone spilled red wine on the rug. Evelyn didn't flinch. She just looked at Lucien, who met her eyes across the room like he already knew what she needed. And she did the strangest thing. She smiled. They made love like they were learning each other all over again. Which, in a way, they were. Not in desperation. Not in defiance of fate. But gently. Intentionally. Lucien touched her like he was memorizing her again, but this time for a future that wasn't promised by stars or dictated by ancient scrolls. A future they were building. Evelyn touched him like she was letting go of every version of herself who had once been too afraid to want this. It was messy. Sweet. Loud, at one point. They knocked over a lamp. Didn't matter. There were worse things than being a little clumsy with happiness. One morning, Evelyn found Lucien in the backyard, staring at their second attempt at tomato plants. They were growing. Slowly. Awkwardly. But there were actual green buds now. She came up behind him, wrapped her arms around his middle. "I'm proud of us," she said. "For what? Not killing the tomatoes? For choosing this. Every day." Lucien tilted his head, brushed his lips over her temple. "I'd choose you," he said, "in every timeline." She looked up at him, her heart full. "And I'd choose you," she whispered, "even if I had to start from scratch." Chapter 21. Life, One Love. There were no celestial omens. No blood moons. No chanting seers. No burning sigils carved into the ground. Just a grey morning and the sound of toast popping. Evelyn stood in their kitchen, barefoot, wearing one of Lucien's shirts and staring down the toaster like it had personally wronged her. Which, to be fair, it had. This was the third slice it had launched halfway across the room like a disgruntled cannon. Lucien caught the flying toast with inhuman reflexes and a mildly amused expression. "You're the one who insisted on a vintage aesthetic. I didn't realize vintage came with a death wish." He bit into the toast and shrugged. "Adds excitement." Evelyn rolled her eyes and turned to pour coffee, the familiar ritual grounding her. Coffee. Morning banter. The scent of damp leaves drifting through the open kitchen window. It was ordinary. Which was still, to her, a kind of miracle. Because she'd spent so long living in extremes, survival, prophecy, palace intrigue, passion hot enough to melt bone, that now, this stillness, this normalcy, felt more radical than any ancient magic. Lucien came up behind her and rested his chin on her shoulder. "Wanna skip today?" he murmured. "Run away. Chase squirrels. Defy capitalism. You've been spending too much time with Bean. Don't deflect. You're twitchy." She sighed and leaned back into him, letting his warmth seep into her skin. "It's just the date." His arms tightened around her. Ah. So he hadn't forgotten. Today was the anniversary not of their meeting, or their soul bond, or the time she'd stabbed a duke in the thigh for calling her a pet. No, today was the date she'd woken up back in her world. Alone. Until Lucien found her again. Until they found each other. They didn't do ceremonies. They'd already survived too many rituals carved from pain and expectation. So when Evelyn suggested, quietly, casually, over wine and leftover dumplings, that maybe they mark the day in their own way, Lucien had simply said, "Tell me when and where." She'd chosen the botanical garden. Not for sentiment, but for science. Photosynthesis had always fascinated her, how a leaf could capture light and spin it into life. It felt appropriate. A metaphor made manifest. Lucien, naturally, got them kicked out of 2 exhibits for touching things labeled "Do Not Touch." She didn't care. He looked so genuinely awed by the orchid greenhouse that she let him wander like a child in a cathedral. His fingers ghosted over petals, his breath fogging the glass terrarium walls. When they reached the moss room, she caught him whispering in Old Wolf to a cluster of ferns. "Are you communing with the plants? They're better listeners than some people. They're plants. They don't interrupt." Fair. They found a quiet bench under a canopy of hanging wisteria. Bees buzzed lazily nearby, and Evelyn swatted one away with the practiced reflex of a city girl who respected nature from a distance. Lucien watched her with that look, the one he'd had even when she'd thought he was just a very fluffy dog. Like she was the axis of his world. Like his bones remembered her before his mind did. She took a breath. "I don't want to belong to anyone." Lucien nodded slowly. "I know. I don't want to be fate's puppet. Or someone's prophecy. I don't want to be worshipped. Or used. Or broken into pieces to fit someone else's narrative." Still, he waited. "I want," she said, "to choose." Lucien's eyes darkened, but not with anger. With something deeper. Steadier. As if every nerve in his body were suddenly attuned to hers. "Then choose me," he said quietly. "Not a demand. Not a plea. Just an offering." Evelyn reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a ring. It wasn't ornate. No diamonds. No ceremonial inscriptions. Just a band of twisted metal, forged by Isolde's friend who moonlighted as a blacksmith and a barista. Lucien had once called it delightfully ugly, which was why she'd bought it. Because it wasn't perfect. But it was real. She held it out. This isn't about claiming or being claimed. It's about waking up every day and still wanting this, wanting us. No gods. No curses. Just breakfast toast and bad jokes and you singing to houseplants. Lucien stared at the ring like it was the moon. Then, wordlessly, he pulled one from his pocket. Hers was sleeker, steel and starlight, forged in silence. It bore no crest. Only a shallow groove shaped like a crescent, his moon to her sun, if she were into metaphors, which she very much was. He slid it onto her finger. You once said love isn't fate. It's chemistry. I lied, she whispered, heart pounding. It's both. He smiled like the world had just rewritten itself. And this time, they sealed their bond with a kiss born not from desperation or magic or apocalypse. But choice. Slow. Human. Infinite. They returned home in the blue hush of late afternoon, the kind of still hour that made cities seem quieter than they were. The sky was painted in strokes of pink and soft steel, the kind of sunset that made you believe the world could be soft if you let it. Lucien carried her shoes. Not because she asked, but because she had taken them off halfway through the park when her feet started to ache and he'd crouched wordlessly to lift them like a knight offering his back to a weary queen. It was a stupidly intimate thing. And Evelyn had loved him for it with a kind of aching ferocity that made her want to cry into his hoodie. He didn't say anything when she kissed his wrist, just above the edge of her ring, right there where his pulse beat like a promise. They made pasta. Well, Evelyn tried to make pasta. Lucien got distracted by a squirrel on the windowsill, declared it a portent of domestic blessings, and overcooked the garlic. The result was something halfway between a culinary experiment and an edible metaphor. They ate it anyway. On the couch. With their knees touching and a candle flickering between them, even though the overhead lights worked just fine. Remember when you didn't know what pasta was? She asked, twirling a limp noodle and raising a brow. Lucien groaned. And you fed me the microwavable kind. That stuff could dissolve a silver dagger. It's a delicacy of desperation. I was very nearly murdered by preservatives. You lived. He leaned over and kissed her temple. I did. Later, Evelyn curled up beside him in bed, the quiet kind of full that had nothing to do with food and everything to do with the way Lucien's heartbeat settled against her back like a lullaby. You never ask me if I'm happy, she said, tracing the moon-shaped groove on her new ring. I'd rather show you. She rolled to face him. Show me now. Lucien blinked, then smiled with slow, amused affection. You're going to make me narrate my emotional state, aren't you? Emotionally intelligent boyfriends are sexy. He sighed dramatically and pulled the comforter up around them like a cocoon. Fine. I'm happy. Deeply, stupidly happy. I feel like I've finally evolved beyond apex predator to golden retriever in love. She laughed. You've always been both. I'm happy, he continued, his voice quiet now, because you're here. Because we get to argue about dishwasher racks and tomato plants and the ethics of squirrel surveillance. Because no prophecy or ancient bloodline decided this for us. We did. We do, every day. Evelyn swallowed around the lump in her throat. That's good, she whispered. Because I am, too. The house creaked with the night. Outside, the world turned. Stars blinked overhead. Some wolves, somewhere, still howled for gods that would never answer. But in this house, in this tiny, rented slice of reality, they were safe. Not in the sense of being untouched, but in the sense of being held. Lucien was snoring lightly when Evelyn slipped out of bed. She padded barefoot into the living room and pulled a notebook from the shelf. One of the ones she'd filled with sketches and notes and theories back when magic had been a looming threat and not just a word she whispered into Lucien's hair. On the first blank page, she began to write. Hypothesis. Love, unshaped by prophecy, still adheres to its own laws. Observation. Lucien eats ice cream with a knife when unsupervised. Conclusion. We are a miracle in sweatpants. She closed the notebook and smiled. A week later, they adopted another dog. This one was blind in both eyes and had a bark like an old lawnmower, but Lucien said, he's got alpha energy, and Evelyn was too enchanted by the way he knelt to let the creature sniff his hand to object. They named him Newton. Because why not? Newton had figured out gravity, and this dog had clearly figured out how to trip Lucien with his tail 3 times in 1 hour. Lucien didn't mind. He called it tactical training. Evelyn called it karma. They hung their rings on a nail by the door whenever they worked in the garden. It wasn't symbolic. It was just practical. But sometimes, when she passed by and saw them there side by side, imperfect circles forged from 2 different metals, she felt it in her ribs. This wasn't a love forged in prophecy. It was a practice. An everyday choosing. Not despite the world they'd come from, but because of it. Because they knew what it meant to hurt. To lose. To burn. And still, they stood here, hands dirty from soil, building something new. One night, curled into each other under a pile of blankets and a snoring Newton, Evelyn whispered, "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't found you in the forest that day?" Lucien hummed, his nose buried in her hair. "Then I would have found you." She smiled. "Confident, are we? I'm a wolf, sweetheart. I'd sent you across time." "You did," she murmured. "Didn't you?" He kissed the back of her neck, slow and reverent. "And I always will." Thank you for listening. If this story touched your heart, give it a like and subscribe for more beautiful tales. Tap the next thumbnail to continue your journey.